Experience life in Nazareth in the time of Jesus. 24 hours in a Galilean village. Imagine, just for a moment, waking up not to the sound of an alarm, not to the glow of a screen, not to the hum of a world built on machines and electricity, but to the first breath of wind sweeping across limestone hills, carrying the scent of wild thyme and freshly turned earth, and the distant bleating of sheep on the slopes above. Imagine opening your eyes in a small room carved partly into rock, where the ceiling is low and the air is cool and damp, and the only light comes from a clay oil lamp flickering on a stone ledge, its tiny flame casting trembling shadows on the rough walls. This is Nazareth. This is a village so small, so insignificant in the eyes of the wider world, that most people across the ancient lands have never even heard its name spoken aloud. And yet, within these humble walls, within these narrow, winding paths and terraced gardens clinging to the hillside, an entire world pulses with life, with daily struggle, with hope and sorrow and love and the quiet, resilient dignity of people who work the land with their hands and trust in something greater than themselves. For the next 24 hours, you will walk these dusty roads. You will feel the sun burning on the back of your neck. You will hear the voices of people whose names were never written in any scroll or carved into any monument, but whose lives were as rich and as complicated and as deeply felt as any life that has ever been lived on this earth. This is not some distant, abstract past sealed behind glass in a museum. This is a living, breathing world. And it begins right now. The sky over the Galilee was still the color of dark cloth, deep and heavy and pricked with fading stars, when Yosef ben Mattiyahu opened his eyes. He did not need a rooster to tell him it was time to rise, though somewhere in the village a rooster was indeed beginning its first tentative calls. His body knew the hour. After more than 20 years of rising before the sun, his muscles and bones had learned the rhythm of the earth itself, and they pulled him upward from the thin mat of woven reeds where he slept beside his wife, Miriam. She stirred at his movement, a slight shift of her body beneath the rough woolen blanket, but she did not wake. Her breathing remained steady and soft, like the sound of a distant stream trickling over smooth stones, and Yosef was careful not to disturb her further. She needed her rest. The days were long for her, longer in some ways than they were for him, because her labor never truly ended, not even when the sun went down. Yosef sat for a moment on the edge of the sleeping mat, his bare feet pressed against the cool stone floor. The room was small, perhaps 8 feet across and 10 feet deep, with walls of rough-cut limestone that his own father had helped to shape decades ago when the family had expanded and needed more space. The stones fit together with a craftsman's precision, though no mortar had been used in the interior walls, just careful selection and patient fitting, stone against stone, each one chosen for the way it locked against its neighbor. In the corner nearest the door, a clay jar held water drawn the evening before from the village well. Beside it, wrapped in a square of linen cloth, a few rounds of barley bread sat waiting for the morning meal. Above the low doorway, a mezuzah was fixed to the frame, a small rectangular container of fired clay, holding inside it a tiny scroll of scripture, the words of the Shema written in careful Hebrew letters by a scribe in one of the larger towns. Every doorway in the village bore one. It was a sign of identity, of belonging, a reminder of the covenant that bound every household in this community to a tradition stretching back through generations beyond counting. Yosef was a tekton. The Greek word is often translated simply as carpenter, but in the reality of first-century Galilee, it meant something much broader, something closer to builder or general craftsman. He worked with wood when wood was available, which was not as often as people might suppose, because in this rocky, semi-arid landscape, timber was scarce and expensive, imported from the forested regions to the north or purchased at considerable cost from merchants in the larger towns. More commonly, Yosef worked with stone. He quarried it, shaped it, fitted it. He carved lintels and door frames and thresholds. He repaired crumbling walls and built new ones. He fashioned yokes for oxen and handles for plows and the heavy stone wheels used in olive presses. His hands were thick and deeply calloused, mapped with small scars from decades of working with sharp tools and rough materials. His forearms were roped with hard muscle, and his back carried the permanent low ache of a man who had spent most of his waking hours bent over his work. He was 38 years old, an age that in this time and place put him well past the midpoint of an average life. He looked older than his years. The relentless Galilean sun had carved deep lines around his eyes and across his forehead, and his beard, which had once been as black as a raven's wing, was now generously threaded with silver and gray. But his eyes remained sharp and watchful, dark brown and deeply set beneath heavy brows, the eyes of a man who had learned to observe carefully before speaking, to measure twice and cut once, both in his work and in his dealings with others. And when he smiled, which happened less often than his wife would have liked, the years seemed to fall away from his face like dust shaken from a traveling cloak, revealing the younger man still living somewhere beneath the weathered surface. He rose and moved quietly across the room, stepping with the practiced caution of a man accustomed to navigating a dark house without waking its sleeping inhabitants. The doorway to the adjacent sleeping space was covered by a hanging curtain of goat hair, dark and coarse, and from behind it came the sounds of his children sleeping. There were 4 of them. The eldest was a boy named Shimon, 14 years old, tall for his age and already developing the broad shoulders and strong hands of a working man. Shimon had been apprenticing alongside his father for the past 2 years, learning the skills of the tekton, and Yosef was quietly proud of the boy's progress, though he was careful not to show it too openly, believing that excessive praise could make a young man soft and complacent. After Shimon came 2 daughters, Hadassah, who was 11, a serious and capable girl who was quickly mastering the domestic skills that her mother was teaching her, and Rivka, who was 8, a quiet, watchful child with enormous dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything they saw, processing and storing information with an intensity that sometimes startled the adults around her. And finally, there was the youngest, a boy called Natan, just 5 years old, a bundle of restless energy and endless curiosity who clung to his mother in sleep, the way a vine clings to a sun-warmed wall, his small body curled against hers, his fist tangled in the fabric of her tunic. Yosef paused at the curtain and listened. He could hear their breathing, layered and overlapping, each one distinct if you knew what to listen for. Shimon's deep and steady, Hadassah's quiet and even, Rivka's almost imperceptible, and Natan's punctuated by the occasional small sigh or murmur that signaled the movements of a child's restless dreams. The sound of them, this small chorus of innocence and dependence, produced in Yosef a feeling that he had never been able to adequately name. A tightness in his chest that was not pain exactly, but something that contained both gratitude and fear in equal measure. Gratitude for their existence, for the miraculous fact that these 4 lives had come from his and Miriam's love and were growing and thriving and filling the house with noise and laughter and complication. And fear, the constant underlying fear of a father who knows that the world beyond these walls is not always kind, that illness can come without warning, that accident and injury are constant companions of daily labor, that the political situation in their occupied land was volatile and unpredictable, and that his ability to protect these 4 small lives was ultimately limited by forces far beyond his control. He let the curtain fall and stepped through the low doorway into the courtyard beyond. The courtyard was the true center of domestic life, shared in this case with the family of Yosef's younger brother, Yaakov, whose rooms opened onto the same open space from the opposite side. This arrangement was common throughout Nazareth and indeed throughout most of the Galilee. Houses were not typically single, freestanding structures, but clusters of rooms, often belonging to members of an extended family, built around a central outdoor area where much of the daily work of living took place. Cooking, weaving, grinding grain, repairing tools, socializing with neighbors, disciplining children, conducting the countless small negotiations that constituted family life. All of this happened in the courtyard, under the open sky, in the shared space that was simultaneously private and communal, intimate and exposed. The courtyard was roughly square, perhaps 20 feet on each side, paved with flat stones that had been laid and leveled by Yosef himself when he and Miriam had first established their household here more than 15 years ago. Against the far wall stood the taban, the domed clay oven used for baking bread, its mouth dark with the ashes of yesterday's fire. Nearby, a large flat stone served as the base for the grinding mill, a pair of heavy circular stones that Miriam and Shoshana, Yaakov's wife, used each morning to grind their daily supply of grain into flour. A wooden frame against one wall held a loom, its partially finished fabric stretching between the beams like a web frozen in progress. Several clay pots of various sizes were stacked near the cistern, a deep plastered pit cut into the bedrock beneath the courtyard that collected and stored rainwater during the wet season. And in the far corner, tethered to a wooden post driven into a gap between the paving stones, a goat stood watching Yosef with horizontal yellow eyes that managed to be simultaneously blank and judgmental, as if the animal were perpetually unimpressed by the activities of the humans who shared its living space. The air was cool, almost cold against his exposed skin. Nazareth sat in the hills of Lower Galilee, roughly 1,200 feet above the level of the Great Sea to the west, and the nights here could be surprisingly chill, particularly in the months following the autumn rains when the ground was still damp and the air held moisture. Yosef pulled his outer garment, a rectangular piece of heavy, undyed wool that served as both cloak and blanket, tighter around his shoulders and looked upward. The sky was beginning its slow transformation. The deep black of full night was softening along the eastern horizon, bleeding into shades of purple and deep blue, and a single bright star, the last holdout against the advancing dawn, still burned directly overhead, fierce and unwavering, like a lamp left burning in an empty room by someone who intended to return. He took a deep breath and held it for a moment, letting the cool air fill his lungs completely, before releasing it in a long, slow exhalation. The air smelled of damp stone and sleeping animals, of the faint sweetness of the fig trees that grew on the terraces above the village, and beneath everything, the clean mineral scent of the limestone that formed the bones of this land, the rock from which the houses were built and the hills were shaped, the ancient, patient stone that had been here long before any human hand had touched it and would be here long after every hand had returned to dust. It smelled, in a word, like home. And that single complex scent, unnoticed by those who breathed it every day, contained within it the entire world of Yosef ben Mariyahu, his past, his present, his hopes, his fears, his love for his family, his pride in his craft, his weariness at the end of long days, and his stubborn, inarticulate belief that the life he was living, humble and hard as it was, had meaning and purpose and value. He crossed the courtyard to the cistern and drew water in a clay cup, splashing it over his face and hands in the ritual washing that began every day. The water was cold, shockingly so, and it drove the last remnants of sleep from his body and mind like a sharp wind clearing fog from a valley. He murmured the morning blessing, the familiar Hebrew words rising automatically from the deep well of memory where they had been stored since childhood. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us concerning the washing of hands. He dried his face with the edge of his cloak and turned to face the day. Nazareth, the place where Yosef had been born and where he expected to die, was a very small village. Estimates of its population in this period vary, but the most careful archaeological and historical analyses suggest somewhere between 300 and 400 inhabitants, a number so small that everyone knew everyone else by name, by family, by reputation, by the particular sound of their footsteps on the village paths. It occupied a natural basin in the Galilean hills, a shallow depression surrounded by higher ground on all sides, with terraced agricultural fields spreading outward and upward from the village center in concentric rings. To the east, the terrain dropped away sharply toward the vast, fertile plain of Jezreel, the breadbasket of the region, a flat expanse of farmland that stretched for miles and that had served for centuries as both a trade corridor and a battlefield. To the north, the hills rose toward the higher elevations of Upper Galilee, wild and sparsely populated country where bandits sometimes sheltered, and where the Romans maintained an uneasy and often tenuous control. To the south, a network of paths and rudimentary roads wound through the hills toward Samaria, and eventually, after several days of walking, toward Jerusalem, the holy city at the heart of the Jewish world. And to the west, invisible from the village itself but never entirely absent from the consciousness of its inhabitants, lay the Great Sea, the vast and mysterious body of water that marked the edge of the known world for most of the people who lived in these inland hills. But Nazareth itself was far removed from all of these larger realities. It sat off the main trade routes that connected the important cities of the region, cities like Sepphoris and Tiberias and Caesarea and Jerusalem. No major road passed through it or even particularly near it. It had no marketplace of any significance, no Roman garrison, no public buildings of architectural note, no theater, no bathhouse, no forum, none of the amenities that characterized urban life in the Roman provinces. It was, by any measure the wider world might apply, insignificant. A backwater, a place of farmers, shepherds, and laborers, of people who worked with their hands and lived close to the earth and measured their wealth not in coins, but in jars of olive oil and sacks of grain, and the number of healthy children sleeping behind their goat hair curtains. In the cities and larger towns, people sometimes spoke of Nazareth with mild contempt or dismissive amusement. Can anything good come from Nazareth, they would say, and the rhetorical question carried within it an entire social hierarchy, a world in which place of origin determined worth and possibility, in which the accident of being born in one village rather than another could define the boundaries of a life. And yet for those who lived there, for the families who had occupied these hills for generations, Nazareth was not insignificant. It was home. It was the center of the world. By the time the first edge of the sun broke above the eastern hills, painting the limestone walls of the village in shades of gold and amber, the community was already fully awake and in motion. Doors opened throughout the village, releasing thin streams of smoke from morning cooking fires into the still air. Voices called out across courtyards and narrow alleyways, exchanging greetings, issuing instructions, scolding children, arranging the business of the day with the efficient shorthand of people who have been neighbors for so long that full sentences are often unnecessary. And above and beneath and woven through all of these human sounds was the rhythm of the grinding stone, that deep, scraping, percussive pulse that defined the morning in every village across the Galilee. Women bent over their hand mills, pushing the upper stone in a circular motion over the lower, crushing dried barley kernels into coarse flour that would be mixed with water and salt and a pinch of saved sourdough and baked into the flat, dense rounds of bread that were the foundation of every meal. This was the sound of survival, as elemental and as essential as breathing itself. Without the grinding stone, there was no flour. Without flour, there was no bread. And without bread, there was no life. Miriam was already at the grinding stone when Joseph returned to the courtyard from the cistern. She had risen quietly while he was washing, dressing quickly in the semi-darkness, and moving with the economical grace of a woman who had been performing these tasks for so many years that her body could do them almost without the involvement of her conscious mind. She was a small woman, perhaps 5 feet tall, with a compact, wiry build that disguised a surprising physical strength. Her face was weathered but handsome, with high cheekbones and a firm jaw and dark, expressive eyes that could communicate an entire range of emotions without a word being spoken. Her hair, dark brown with the first threads of gray, was pulled back tightly beneath a linen head covering, as was customary for married women, and her hands, which moved with fluid, practiced efficiency over the grinding stone, were rough and cracked from years of work with water and stone and raw fiber. She did not look up as Joseph approached, but she spoke, and her voice carried the warmth and ease of long familiarity, the voice of a woman addressing the man she had shared her life with for 16 years. Shimon has already gone. He said he would meet you at the quarry before the sun clears the ridge. Joseph nodded. The quarry was a small excavation about a 20-minute walk from the village, where a wealthy landowner from the nearby city of Sepphoris had commissioned the cutting of stone blocks for a new residential building. The work was physically demanding, but it paid well, better than most of the jobs available to village craftsmen, and in a community like Nazareth, where actual coined money was scarce and the majority of transactions were conducted through barter and exchange of goods, the opportunity to earn real wages in silver or copper was something to be valued and protected. Joseph tore a piece of bread from one of the rounds that sat on the linen cloth and chewed it slowly, deliberately. The bread was dense and coarse, made from barley rather than wheat, with a heavy, slightly sour flavor that took some getting used to for anyone accustomed to the lighter, sweeter taste of wheat bread. But wheat was expensive, a luxury that families like Joseph's reserved for Sabbath meals and festival celebrations. Barley was the grain of the common people, the grain that had sustained the poor and the working classes of this land for thousands of years, filling bellies reliably, if not elegantly, providing the fuel that bodies needed to endure long hours of hard physical labor. He took a sip of water from a clay cup and then a few olives from a small bowl, popping them into his mouth one at a time and chewing thoughtfully, spitting the pits into his palm and setting them aside. This was breakfast. Simple, unadorned, sufficient. He watched Miriam work as he ate, and he thought, as he often did in these quiet early morning moments, that she was in many ways the stronger of the two of them. Not physically stronger, though she was tougher than she looked, but stronger in that deeper sense, stronger in spirit, in endurance, in the quiet and unshakable resolve that held a household together through the inevitable crises and disappointments and grinding daily pressures that marked the passage of every year. She had borne 5 children, 4 of whom had survived, and the one who had not, a baby girl who had lived only 6 days before a sudden fever carried her away, was a grief that Miriam carried within her always, not on the surface where others could see it, but deep down in the private chambers of her heart, like a stone at the bottom of a well. She had grieved that loss with a ferocity that had frightened Yosef, a grief so deep and so raw and so total that it had seemed to tear the very air around her, to darken the sunlight and sour the water and make the walls of their home close in like a fist. And then, after the prescribed days of mourning had passed, she had stood up, washed her face with cold water from the cistern, and returned to her work. Not because the grief was gone, for it was not gone and never would be, but because the living needed her. The grinding stone needed turning, the bread needed baking, the children needed feeding and clothing and comforting and guiding. And so she went on. She always went on. It was, Yosef believed, the most courageous thing he had ever witnessed. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal. If you have not yet subscribed, do it now, because this channel brings you stories that make you feel what it was truly like to live in another time, stories crafted to stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a journey like this one. Yosef leaned forward and pressed his lips briefly against Miriam's forehead, a small, familiar gesture of affection that she accepted with a slight softening of her expression. A brief relaxation of the lines around her eyes that was, in their private vocabulary of touch and silence, equivalent to a smile. Then he turned and stepped through the narrow passage that connected the courtyard to the village path beyond. The path was unpaved, a track of packed earth and loose stones that wound between the houses like a dry stream, finding its way through a landscape of boulders. The houses on either side were variations on a single theme. Simple, solid, functional structures of local limestone, with flat roofs made of wooden beams overlaid with layers of branches, dried mud, and packed earth. Some were slightly larger than others, reflecting subtle differences in family size or economic status, and a few had small upper rooms, accessible by an external stone staircase, that served as guest chambers or storage spaces. But the overall impression was of uniformity, of a community that lived within narrow material boundaries, and that expressed its individuality not through architecture, but through the subtler languages of relationship, reputation, craft, and character. As Yosef walked, he encountered other men heading to their various places of work. There was Eli the potter, a thin, quiet, slightly stooped man in his 40s whose fingers were permanently stained with the gray-brown residue of the local clay. A man who spent his days at the wheel producing the jars, bowls, cooking pots, storage vessels, and oil lamps that every household needed, and that, because they were fragile and subject to constant breakage, needed to be replaced on a regular basis. Eli was one of the most essential craftsmen in the village, though his quiet manner and unassuming appearance meant that he was often overlooked in the social calculations that determined status and influence. There was old Zechariah the shepherd, a weathered, bandy-legged man of indeterminate age who tended a flock of perhaps 40 sheep and goats on the hills above the village, and who walked with a crooked staff and a permanent squint, the result of decades spent staring into the distance across sun-bleached landscapes, scanning for predators and strays. And there was Boaz ben Eleazar, the acknowledged elder and informal leader of the village, a broad-shouldered, white-bearded man with a commanding presence and a voice like rolling thunder, who served as judge, mediator, interpreter of the law, and presiding authority at the village synagogue. Boaz was the closest thing Nazareth had to a government, and his word carried a weight that derived not from any official appointment, but from the accumulated respect of a community that had watched him, for 30 years, handle disputes and crises with a combination of firmness, fairness, and practical wisdom. Boaz raised a thick hand in greeting as Yosef passed. "Shalom, Yosef." "Shalom, Boaz." Yosef paused, as courtesy required. "I heard your wife has been unwell. How is she?" A shadow crossed Boaz's broad face, a brief dimming of the confidence that usually radiated from him like heat from a forge. "The fever broke during the night. Thanks be to God. My daughter-in-law has been at her side. She seems to be mending." "May she continue to recover and return to strength quickly," Yosef said, and he meant it. Boaz's wife, a formidable woman named Keturah, was a pillar of the community in her own right, and her illness had been a source of genuine concern throughout the village. Boaz nodded, accepting the good wishes, then shifted the subject with the ease of a man accustomed to managing conversations. "And your boy, Shimon? I hear good things about his work at the quarry." Yosef allowed himself a small, careful smile. "He has strong hands and a willing heart. Those are good foundations to build on." "Indeed they are," Boaz agreed. "Indeed they are." They parted, and Yosef continued up the path, the village gradually falling behind him as the track climbed toward the ridge above the basin where Nazareth sheltered. The landscape through which he walked was both harsh and strikingly beautiful, a paradox that defined the Galilee. The hills were covered with a mix of scrubby bushes, wild grasses, and scattered trees, mostly olive and fig, with occasional terebinths and ancient oaks that had somehow survived centuries of clearing and cutting. In the spring, after the rains, these same hillsides would explode with wildflowers, vast carpets of red anemones and yellow mustard blossoms, and purple iris and white narcissus that transformed the rugged landscape into something almost impossibly vivid, a painter's palette thrown across the earth. But now, in the dry months, the colors were muted, a palette of tans and browns and dusty greens and the pale gold of dried grass, beautiful in its own austere way, but demanding a more practiced eye to appreciate. The sun was climbing quickly now, and with it the temperature. By the middle of the day, the heat would be fierce, pressing down on the land like a physical weight, and every living creature, human and animal alike, would seek whatever shade was available and wait for the worst of it to pass. Shimon was waiting at the quarry when Yosef arrived. The boy was sitting on a large block of partially shaped limestone, methodically sharpening a bronze chisel with a flat whetstone, his movements careful and rhythmic. He looked up as his father's footsteps crunched on the gravel and grinned, showing teeth that were white and slightly crooked. "You are late, Abba." "And you are impatient," Yosef replied, but his voice carried warmth rather than censure. He examined the chisel, running his thumb along the newly sharpened edge. "Good work. A clean edge makes clean cuts. Remember that. You have told me 100 times, and I will tell you 100 more." They set to work. The quarry was a shallow excavation in the limestone hillside, perhaps 30 paces wide and 10 deep, where the rock lay in thick, relatively even layers close to the surface. The work of extracting building stone from such a site was labor-intensive and demanded both physical strength and considerable skill. First, the upper surface of the desired block had to be scored with chisels, creating a groove that would guide the fracture line. Then wooden wedges were driven into the groove at regular intervals, and these wedges were soaked repeatedly with water, causing them to swell and exert enormous lateral pressure on the stone. Over time, sometimes hours, sometimes an entire day, the pressure would cause the stone to crack cleanly along the scored line, yielding a rough block that could then be shaped and dressed with chisels and hammers to the required dimensions. It was slow, methodical, painstaking work that required both patience and a deep understanding of the material. A careless blow could shatter a block that had taken a full day to free from the bedrock. A misread fracture line could send a crack running in the wrong direction, ruining an entire section of stone. And the constant danger of falling rock, of chisels that slipped, of hammers that struck fingers instead of wedges, meant that the quarry was a place where vigilance was not optional, but essential. Father and son worked in a rhythm that had become almost instinctive over 2 years of shared labor. Yosef would score the cutting line, his experienced eye reading the stone's grain and natural fractures with an accuracy that came from decades of practice. Shimon would position the wedges, tapping them into the groove with careful, measured blows. Together, they would soak the wedges and wait, then strike again, alternating blows, listening to the sound the stone made under their tools and reading its responses the way a good sailor reads the wind and currents. Stone has a voice, Yosef had told his son early in the apprenticeship, during one of those quiet moments of instruction that are the real substance of any master-apprentice relationship. It speaks to anyone who has the patience to listen. If you learn its language, it will tell you where it wants to break and where it does not. Work with it, not against it, and it will cooperate. Fight it, and it will fight back, and it will always win. The morning hours passed in steady labor, punctuated by brief pauses for water from the goatskin flask that hung in the shade of a rock overhang. Other workers arrived as the morning advanced. Men from Nazareth and from neighboring villages. Some of them experienced tectons like Yosef, and others unskilled laborers who performed the heavy carrying and hauling that the craftsman's work required. The foreman who supervised the operation was a man named Marcus, a Jew from Sepphoris who had adopted a Romanized name, a common practice among Jews who lived and worked in the more cosmopolitan cities where interaction with Roman culture was unavoidable. Marcus was efficient and reasonably fair, and most importantly, from the worker's perspective, he paid on time and in full, which was more than could be said for every employer in the region. But there was always a subtle tension between the village men and the city men who worked alongside them. A low-grade friction born of different worlds and different values rubbing against each other in close quarters. The city men wore finer clothes and spoke a more polished Aramaic, sometimes mixing in Greek words and phrases with an ease that the village men found affected and mildly insulting. And the city men, for their part, sometimes regarded the village workers with a barely concealed condescension, a metropolitan superiority that expressed itself not in overt insults, but in small gestures and glances and tones of voice that communicated clearly enough. We are more sophisticated than you. We know the wider world. You are peasants. Yosef did not let this bother him, or at least he did not let it show. He had encountered this attitude many times in his work and had learned that the most effective response was simply to let his craftsmanship speak for itself. When a city man saw the precision of Yosef's stonework, the cleanness of his cuts, the accuracy of his measurements, the condescension tended to soften. Skill was a universal language, and it commanded respect even from those who were inclined to withhold it. Around the middle of the morning, a commotion erupted near the edge of the quarry. A young worker named Dov, barely older than Shimon, had been carrying a heavy stone block on his shoulders when his sandal slipped on a patch of loose gravel. The block tumbled from his grasp and landed on his left foot. His scream sliced through the steady clatter of chisels and hammers like a blade through silk, raw and high and terrible. Yosef dropped his tools and ran. By the time he reached the boy, several other men had already lifted the fallen block, and Dov was sitting on the ground with tears streaming down his dust-caked face, clutching his injured foot in both hands. The foot was badly crushed and swelling rapidly, the skin already darkening with the deep bruise beneath. But Yosef, kneeling beside him and probing the injury with gentle, experienced fingers, determined that the bones were likely intact. He had seen broken feet before, had seen the unnatural angles and the grinding sensation of fractured bone, and this did not have that quality. It was a severe bruise, agonizing and debilitating, but not a break. "You are fortunate," Yosef told the boy, keeping his voice calm and steady. The voice of a man who understands that panic is contagious and that the best medicine for fear is competence. "It will hurt badly for several days, and you will need to stay off it as much as possible. But it will heal." Dov's eyes were red and wet, but he clenched his jaw against the pain and managed to ask the question that mattered most to him. "Can I still work?" The desperation in his voice was unmistakable and deeply familiar to Yosef. It was the desperation of someone from a family that could not afford to lose even a single day's wages, a family that lived so close to the edge of subsistence that any interruption in income could trigger a cascade of consequences: unpaid debts, reduced food, the slow slide into the kind of poverty from which it was almost impossible to climb back. Yosef looked at Marcus, who had arrived and was standing over them with his arms crossed and an expression that was calculating rather than compassionate. "Give him lighter duties," Yosef said. "He can sort stones by size, sharpen tools, mix mortar. He does not need his feet for that kind of work." Marcus considered, his eyes moving from Dov's injured foot to Yosef's face and back again. "Half wages for half work," he said finally. "That is the best I can offer." It was not generous, but it was fair within the harsh logic of the system in which they all operated. Dov looked as if he might protest, but Yosef placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and squeezed gently, a gesture that said more than words. "Take what is offered. Swallow the frustration. Pride is a luxury you cannot afford right now." "Take it," he said quietly. "Your family needs you earning something, not nothing." The boy took it. The incident stayed with Yosef through the rest of the morning, a shadow at the back of his mind even as his hands continued their work with their customary skill. It was a reminder of how precarious life was for people like them, how narrow the margin between getting by and going under. There was no safety net in this world, no system of compensation for injured workers, no public welfare for families whose breadwinners could not work. If a man was hurt or sick, his family relied on the charity of neighbors and relatives, and while that charity was often generous, it was also limited and unreliable. If the rains failed and the harvest was poor, there was no government granary distributing emergency supplies. If a debt could not be repaid, a man could lose his land, his house, and ultimately his freedom, sold into indentured servitude to work off what he owed. The wealthy had buffers against these catastrophes, layers of stored wealth and social connections that could absorb the shocks of misfortune. The poor had nothing but each other, and sometimes even that was not enough. Tell me in the comments what you would do if you were living in this time, working stone with your hands under the burning sun, knowing that one slip could mean your family goes hungry. Write it down. I want to know. The sun reached its zenith, and the heat became punishing. The workers retreated to whatever shade could be found, settling beneath rock overhangs and the sparse branches of a lone carob tree at the quarry's edge. Yosef and Shimon sat together, sharing their midday meal of barley bread, olives, a handful of dried figs, and a few pieces of hard, salty cheese made from goat's milk. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, washing the food down with water that had grown warm in the goatskin flask. The food was simple but satisfying, providing the calories and sustenance needed to fuel an afternoon of more hard labor. "Abba," Shimon said during a lull in the eating, his voice carrying the particular blend of earnestness and uncertainty that marked his questions about the world. "Why do we work for the people in Sepphoris? They live like Romans. They go to the amphitheater and watch performances. They recline on couches when they eat, like pagans. Some of them barely observe the Sabbath properly." It was a good question, and Yosef took his time answering. "Because they pay honestly for honest work," he said, choosing his words carefully. "And because the stone we shape does not know or care who buys it. It is good stone, Shimon. We cut it well and true, and it will stand in a wall or a doorframe for 100 years, long after the man who paid for it is dust. Our work has its own value, separate from the values of those who commission it." Shimon frowned, not entirely satisfied. "But do you not feel that they look down on us?" Yosef looked at his son. "Some do," he admitted, "and some in our own village look down on them for their ways. People have a deep need to feel superior to others. It is a sickness of the spirit, and it is not cured by argument or by anger. The only cure is to know your own worth and not to need others to confirm it." The boy considered this in silence, turning a fig over and over in his fingers. He was at the age when the world was beginning to reveal its contradictions and complexities, and he was learning, day by day, that the answers he wanted were rarely as simple as the questions. Meanwhile, back in Nazareth, the Women's Day had been just as demanding. After Yosef's departure, Miriam had finished the grinding, mixed and kneaded the dough, and carried the shaped rounds to the courtyard oven, where she took turns with Shoshana, feeding the fire and slapping the flattened bread against the hot interior walls. The bread baked quickly in the fierce heat, puffing and charring slightly, filling the courtyard with an aroma that was, for anyone who had grown up in a Galilean village, the smell of home itself. While the bread baked, Miriam set Hadassah to work at the loom, supervising the girl's technique with a combination of patience and exacting standards. "Tighter," she instructed, watching Hadassah pass the wooden shuttle through the warp threads. "If the weave is loose, the cloth will not hold against wear and rain. And then what are we left with?" Hadassah sighed but adjusted her tension without argument. She was learning, and she knew it. And part of learning was accepting correction, even when it felt repetitive. Rivka, the 8-year-old, had been dispatched to the village well with a clay water jar balanced on her head, a skill she had mastered with the ease of a child who had been watching older women do it since she could walk. The well was more than a source of water. It was the social hub of the village, the place where women gathered each morning and evening to draw water and to exchange the news and observations and opinions that constituted the informational lifeblood of a small community. Rivka was naturally reticent, more inclined to listen than to speak, and she moved through the cluster of chatting women quickly and quietly, filling her jar and turning back toward home. But her ears, as always, were open. And what she heard today was more interesting than usual. The women were talking about a stranger who had arrived in the village the previous evening, a man from Jerusalem who had been seen in conversation with Boaz the elder. The speculation about his purpose was vigorous and varied. Some believed he was a tax assessor, come to squeeze more revenue from the already burdened village. Others guessed he was a merchant seeking to buy olive oil or dried goods, and a few, lowering their voices to conspiratorial whispers, suggested he was an agent of the Roman authorities, sent to identify potential agitators in the always restive Galilean highlands. Rivka carried these fragments of information home and delivered them to her mother with the matter-of-fact solemnity of a child who understood, even at 8, that information had value. Miriam's reaction was subtle but telling, a brief tightening of the muscles around her eyes, a momentary stillness of her hands on the oven's rim. "A man from Jerusalem," she repeated. "Did anyone say his name?" Rivka shook her head. Miriam paused, then resumed her work with slightly quickened movements. "It is probably nothing," she said, more to reassure herself than her daughter. "People come and people go." But the unease in her voice was real, and Rivka, who missed nothing, noted it and stored it away. The stranger's name, as the village learned over the course of the day, was Nathaniel ben Yehuda, and he was a scribe. A professional copyist and legal expert, trained in one of the scribal schools of Jerusalem, who traveled from community to community offering his services, copying scrolls, drafting legal documents, writing letters for those who lacked literacy, and helping to resolve disputes that required specialized knowledge of the law. He had come to Nazareth at Boaz's invitation to help settle a particularly difficult land dispute that had been festering between two prominent village families for years, a dispute over ownership of a valuable olive grove on the hillside east of the village. The details were complicated, the emotions were raw, and the potential for the conflict to fracture the community along factional lines was very real. That evening, when Yosef returned from the quarry, the village was buzzing with anticipation and anxiety about the hearings that would begin the next day. The two families at the center of the dispute, the house of Reuben and the house of Tobias, were both large, deeply rooted, and extensively connected by marriage to other households throughout Nazareth. Taking sides was not only unavoidable, but practically compulsory, since almost everyone was related to one or both parties. The disputed olive grove was a prime piece of agricultural real estate, planted with mature trees that produced oil of exceptional quality, and both families had plausible claims to ownership based on competing oral histories that reached back generations. It was the kind of dispute that could, if handled badly, poison a community for decades. Yosef sat in the courtyard after the evening meal, working by lamplight on a small carving project, a toy donkey for Natan, shaped from a piece of olive wood that he had salvaged from a pruned branch. The wood was smooth and warm in his hands, and the work of shaping it was meditative, a counterpoint to the tensions that were building around him. Miriam sat nearby, mending a tunic by the same small flame. They talked quietly about the dispute, about the stranger, about their fears for the community, about the universal difficulty of living alongside other imperfect human beings in a space too small for avoidance. "What will happen if the ruling goes against Reuven?" Miriam asked. "He is a proud man. He will not accept it easily." "No," Yosef agreed. "But pride does not change the law, and the law does not care about pride. We will have to hope that Nathanael is as wise as he is learned." Miriam set down her mending and looked at him directly. "And if wisdom is not enough?" Yosef met her gaze. "Then we will need something more than wisdom. We will need patience and compassion and the willingness to forgive, which are harder to find than wisdom and worth more when you do." She held his eyes for a moment longer, then smiled. That quiet, almost imperceptible softening that was her private expression of love, and returned to her work. Outside, the stars burned in the infinite darkness, and the village slept, and the olive trees on the disputed hillside stood in their ancient, patient rows, indifferent to the human passions swirling around them, waiting as they had always waited for the sun to return and the cycle to continue. The hearings began the next afternoon. The synagogue was packed beyond capacity, every stone bench occupied, with people standing along the walls and crowding the doorway. Nathanael the scribe presided from a low table, his calm, intelligent eyes moving methodically over the assembled faces. Reuven spoke first, a burly, powerful man whose voice shook with emotion as he described his grandfather Caleb's arrival in Nazareth, the clearing and terracing of the hillside, the planting of the olive trees whose fruit had sustained his family for 3 generations. Tobias followed, thinner and more measured, but no less passionate, arguing that the land had belonged to his ancestors before Caleb ever arrived, that Caleb had been a tenant and not an owner, and that what Reuven called inherited right was in fact inherited presumption. Witnesses came forward, each adding a piece to the puzzle, but none completing it. Old Hannah, the village's eldest resident, offered memories that were vivid in some details and maddeningly vague in others. Other elders contributed their own recollections, which frequently contradicted each other in important particulars. The picture that emerged was a tangle of competing narratives, each containing elements of truth, but none providing a definitive answer. Nathanael listened to all of it with patient attention, filling scroll after scroll with his careful notes, his expression remaining perfectly neutral throughout. Then, on the night after the first day of hearings, the olive grove caught fire. No one saw it start. The alarm was raised by the village watchman who spotted the glow from the ridge above, and within minutes the men of Nazareth were running up the hillside with jars of water and wet cloths, beating at the flames that were consuming the lower terrace of the grove. Yosef and Shimon were among the first to arrive, and they worked frantically in the smoke and heat, their eyes stinging, their lungs burning, until the fire was contained and extinguished. 3 ancient olive trees were destroyed, reduced to blackened skeletons standing in a circle of scorched earth. Accusations flew immediately. Reuven pointed at Tobias. Tobias pointed at Reuven. Boaz, his great frame interposed between the 2 furious men, bellowed for silence and order and was only partially obeyed. In the days that followed, the fire consumed the village's peace as thoroughly as it had consumed the trees. Suspicion and accusation spread from household to household, poisoning friendships and straining bonds of kinship that had been strong for generations. Miriam found herself estranged from her closest friend, Deborah, who was married into Tobias's extended family. Encounters at the well that had once been warm and easy became stiff and guarded. Even the children felt it, returning home from play with questions about whose family was right and whose was wrong. Questions that no parent wanted to answer because any answer risked deepening the division. Yosef was appointed, along with Boaz and a skilled tracker named Ezra, to investigate the fire. They found a sandal track at the edge of the burned area, smaller than a man's, leading down the hillside toward the village. And then Rivka, quiet, watchful Rivka, came to her father one evening and told him what she had seen the night of the fire. A figure with a lamp among the trees, moving quickly and furtively, just before the flames appeared. She believed it was Levi, Reuven's 16-year-old son. The weight of this knowledge settled on Yosef like a stone on his chest. If Levi had set the fire, it was almost certainly an act of misguided loyalty, a teenager's desperate attempt to bolster his father's case by making it appear that Tobias's faction was trying to destroy the grove. The intentions, however clumsy and wrong-headed, would have been rooted in love and family loyalty, which made the situation more tragic, not less. Yosef spent a sleepless night wrestling with his conscience. If he reported what Rivka had told him, it would devastate Reuven's family and possibly destroy the boy's future. If he stayed silent, he was complicit in a deception that would continue to corrode the village from within. It was Miriam, as so often, who found the right path. "Go to the boy," she said. "Not to the scribe, not to Boaz. Go to Levi and give him the chance to do the right thing himself. That is the kindest thing and the bravest thing you can do." The Yosef found Levi the next morning on the path above the village, sitting alone on a rock with the hunched, hollow look of someone carrying a burden too heavy for his young shoulders. The boy tried to deflect, tried to bluff, but Yosef was patient. He told a story from his own youth, about a time when he had taken something that was not his, and how the guilt had eaten at him until he found the courage to confess. He did not lecture, he did not threaten. He simply sat beside the boy and waited, with the same patience he brought to working stone, and eventually, like stone under steady pressure, the boy cracked. Levi's confession, when it came, was accompanied by tears that had been building for days, deep, shuddering sobs that shook his thin frame like a wind shaking a young tree. He had not meant for the fire to spread. He had only intended to burn some brush, to create the appearance of sabotage, but the flames had leaped to the trees faster than he could have imagined, and he had panicked and run. "My father does not know," he gasped between sobs. "No one knows, and I have not slept since that night." Yosef put his arm around the boy's shaking shoulders and held him. "Now you have a choice," he said gently. "You can carry this forever, or you can set it down. It will be hard. It will hurt. But it is the only way forward that does not lead to a darker place." Levi confessed that same afternoon, standing before Nathanael, Boaz, his father Reuven, and the assembled village. Reuven, who had been so fierce and so certain in the hearings, seemed to collapse from within, his broad shoulders curving inward under a weight no muscles could resist. "This is my failing," he said, his voice raw and broken. "Not the boy's. I taught him that winning was everything. I planted the anger in him. The fault is mine." And Tobias, who could have raged or gloated, instead stood slowly and extended his hand across the space between them. "We have been fools," he said simply. "Both of us. And a boy has paid the price for our foolishness." The handshake that followed was perhaps the most significant event in Nazareth that year. Not because it resolved every issue or healed every wound, but because it broke the cycle of escalation and created the space for something better to grow. Nathanael drafted an agreement that placed the grove under joint stewardship, its labor and harvest shared equally, and both families accepted it. The village exhaled. Conversations at the well grew warm again. Children played together without asking whose side they were on. And Levi, who had expected condemnation, found instead a community that offered him what he needed most. Not forgiveness as a single dramatic gesture, but the daily, practical opportunity to rebuild trust through honest work and consistent character. If this story has moved you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories grow stronger when they travel. The seasons turned. The autumn rains came and softened the hard summer earth. The olive harvest arrived and the village mobilized, working together in the grove with a unity that had not been seen in years. Reuven and Tobias stood side by side among the trees, directing the work of their combined families, and the sight of it made old Boaz smile quietly to himself from the edge of the grove, where he sat on a stone bench that Yosef had carved for him, watching the community he had spent his life serving find its way back to wholeness. Yosef's work in Sepphoris continued through the winter months, and the wages he earned, including a surprising silver denarius at the completion of the merchant's courtyard, allowed him to build a small financial cushion for his family, a buffer against the uncertainties that were always lurking at the edges of life. He gave the silver coin to Miriam, who pressed it to her lips, and then tucked it away with the careful reverence of a woman who understood, in her bones, the difference between security and its absence. The winter evenings were spent in teaching and in the slow, rich work of building family. Yosef taught Shimon the advanced techniques of stonework. He taught Hadassah to read a few words of Hebrew, a decision that raised some eyebrows in the more traditional households, but that Yosef defended with quiet stubbornness. He encouraged Rivka's gift for observation, asking her what she noticed and why it mattered, nurturing in her the habit of attention that would serve her well throughout her life. And to little Natan, who was never without his wooden donkey, Yosef told stories, the ancient stories of their people, stories of journeys and promises and faithfulness, and the enduring, stubborn hope that tomorrow would be better than today. Spring returned. The almond trees bloomed white against the brown hills. The anemones carpeted the slopes in red. The days grew longer. The grinding stone turned. The bread baked. The children grew. And life in Nazareth continued as it always had and always would. Not with the drama of great events or the spectacle of grand ambitions, but with the quiet, persistent, immeasurably valuable work of living, of feeding and being fed, of loving and being loved, of building with hands and with heart, day by ordinary, extraordinary day. On one of those spring evenings, Yosef stood again on his rooftop, looking out over the village he had known his entire life. The houses were golden in the last light. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children's voices rose and fell in the narrow paths between homes. Miriam's voice called from the courtyard below, summoning the family to the evening meal, and the sound of it, warm and certain and utterly irreplaceable, cut through the evening air and reached him where he stood, pulling him gently back from the contemplation of the infinite to the reality of the immediate, from the vastness of the sky to the smallness and the greatness of the life that waited for him at the bottom of the stairs. He descended. The courtyard was full of the people he loved most. Miriam at the center, the axis around which everything turned. Shimon, nearly a man now, with calloused hands and thoughtful eyes. Hadassah, quietly competent, weaving at the loom with increasing skill. Rivka, watchful as always, a lizard perched on her finger, its tiny heart beating against her skin. And Natan, boundless, irrepressible Natan, holding up a hoopoe feather he had found by the well, his face blazing with discovery. "Look, Abba, a feather! It is the most beautiful thing in the world." Yosef looked, and it was. If you watched until this point, it is because you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and see who truly loves the stories on this channel. And if you are not yet subscribed, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because this channel exists to bring you stories that make you feel what it is truly like to live in another time in another world. Like this video so it can reach more people, and share it with someone you know will be moved by this journey. Until the next story.